This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. Episode number 170 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. My guest today is Patrick K. O'Donnell. Patrick is a combat historian who has covered the war in Fallujah, Iraq in 2004, where he was armed and participated in the battle alongside the U.S. Marines. He's an expert on special operations units and irregular warfare. He's published 13 books so far on combat history, covering stories from the American Revolution, World War II, the Global War on Terror, and more. He's also the author of The Brenner Assignment, which I read before recording episode number 90 of the podcast with Jack Chappell, the son of OSS Officer Howard Chappell, who was one of the primary subjects of Patrick's book. This is Patrick's second appearance on the podcast. You may remember him from episode number 146 earlier this year, when we discussed his book, The Unvanquished, the untold story of Lincoln's Special Forces, the manhunt for Mosby's Rangers, and the Shadow War that forged America's special operations. I've had several other guests in the past who have appeared more than once on the podcast, but this is the first time I've ever invited an author back to discuss the same book once again. And that's because The Unvanquished is so full of incredible stories that we barely scratched the surface the first time around. And I didn't want my listeners to miss out on so many fascinating events surrounding the Civil War. By the way, if you're looking for a way to get friends and family as interested in history as you are, or if you want to learn something new and unexpected every month, then make sure to check out History by Mail. Every month, History by Mail will send you reproductions of famous and influential historical documents from American history. Accompanying the documents themselves are articles which put them in the context of their times and help you understand the impact they had on the course of American life. The topics are widely varied, so you're always learning something new across themes that include historic inventions, American wars, and foreign diplomatic relations. I'm really enjoying my own subscription because it's opening my eyes to historic events I knew nothing about. You can subscribe for yourself or gift a subscription at historybymail.com for as little as $6.50 a month. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code Justin10 for a permanent 10% off your subscription. Patrick, welcome back.
Thanks for having me, Justin. It's an honor
I
to be
appreciate
on
it.
your show again. And I appreciate the fact that I'm the first to actually come on with the book a second time. That means a lot to me.
Yeah, I felt like we could have talked for 3 hours the first time around. I didn't want to do that to you on your whirlwind book tour at the time, but going back through just a few months later and rereading it, it certainly took me back and just exposed me to kind of, I would almost say, the wonder of everything that occurred during that war between brothers there, really. So it's truly a unique time in American history, and I'm really glad to explore it with you again.
Thank you. Yeah, the book, The Unvanquished, is much like the Brenner assignment that you mentioned earlier, in the sense that it's its own world. And there's just so many story threads that kind of come together and intertwine that brings the reader back in time to the Civil War, in the Civil War that most people aren't familiar with, even experts, because it's the underside of the war. It's the unconventional. It's the irregular side of warfare, and specifically going into the Jesse Scouts and Lincoln Special Forces
Mm-hmm.
and their rivals.
Yeah, it was so unique to me, and it was so different than what I'm used to for so many reasons, really. So, if you don't mind, Patrick, to start off with, for those who may not have heard the first episode or may not remember everything that we talked about, can you just kind of give a brief interview of like the Jesse Scouts that you mentioned and Mosby's Rangers, who are featured so heavily throughout the book?
Yeah, there's really three storylines in this book. The main through line of The Unvanquished is it's the Jesse Scouts. Jesse Scouts are roughly 200 men, give or take, that are really the Union Army's first commandos. They're really extraordinary individuals. They dress as Confederates to gain an advantage on their opponents. They conduct everything from raids, high value capture targets, to conducting tactical and strategic intelligence for the armies that they're in many cases leading. They're often in the front, in the vanguard, to gain tactical intelligence on what's going on. They're also couriers. Their story begins in 1861 with John C. Fremont, the Pathfinder, the great Pathfinder explorer, who explores the American West. And he's given command of the Missouri Department in 1861 and brings into the department scouts, men in some cases that he utilized in the American West during his explorations. John C. Fremont's an extraordinary figure in many, many ways. United States Senator from California, general officer, but also has really some groundbreaking ideas. Also the first Republican candidate, 1856, and later in 1864. But John C. Fremont brings these scouts into his army in 1861 to really sort of quell the irregular fighting that's going on in bloody Missouri. And these men are very, very helpful. But the connection that they have, they're called Jesse Scouts because of his wife, Jessie, who is an extraordinary woman, one of the most extraordinary women of the age. Senator's daughter, very charismatic. One of the most popular quotes at the time was that she was the better man of the two, of her husband. Just an extraordinary woman. The scouts really looked up to her. And some say that it was Jessie that came up with the idea that the men would dress in Confederate uniforms to gain an advantage on their opponents. They have a very checkered past at the beginning. I mean, they do some great tradecraft. They're involved in some really extraordinary operations. But the commanding officer of the Jesse Scouts, John Carpenter, he's got an interesting background. He's a bit of a braggart. He likes to, show off. He's a liar in many cases, but he also will steal anything that's not nailed down. And he and many of the scouts developed a reputation that's unseemly. It doesn't really fit well with the Union Army. And these men, Carpenter in particular, is cashiered out of the unit. And it kind of goes away with the exception of a small remnant of men. And they're passed around to various Union Army groups until they come to General Averill. And he's in charge of the area within West Virginia, and he really utilizes these men. And then it becomes another group called Blazer Scouts, which is under General Crook's command. And they are really the first counterinsurgency group, for the modern counterinsurgency group for the United States Army. Blazer Scouts are manhunters, and they go after the South's most dangerous men. Beginning in West Virginia, they go after a series of partisans there, and then they eventually go after John Singleton Mosby. So the book has the Jesse Scouts as conducting not only intelligence kind of gathering, commando operations, going after high-value targets, but also kind of coin work, which is way ahead of its time, especially with Blazer. And they're not using a blowtorch, they're using novel intelligence gathering techniques. They're using a kind word and a gun in most cases, and they're befriending civilians, Southern civilians, and gaining their trust and gaining information, and that's actionable. That's sort of a thumbnail of the Jesse Scouts, and they are very active throughout the war, and they played a huge role, unreported role until the Unvanquished, where they are instrumental in a number of significant battles. For instance, the Third Battle of Winchester, where their intelligence helps turn the tide, or the Battle of Five Forks, which is one of the most crucial battles of the American Civil War, which leads to the Lee's precipitous retreat towards Appomattox. And it's the Jesse Scouts that play a huge role there in the Appomattox campaign. And they're also extremely instrumental in an underreported and largely unknown aspect of the American Civil War, America's role in the insurgency in Mexico, and really our first proxy war with a European power, where the French have 40,000 combat troops on our border throughout most of the Civil War and after. and it's the Jesse Scouts that play a crucial role in conducting irregular operations that really turn the tide there.
Incredible. And they never numbered more than 200 or so, as you said?
That's correct.
My
And
gosh.
what's even more fascinating is within this group, a large percentage of them would never come home from the war because the activities were so dangerous. Many of these men died in the line of duty. In many cases, behind the lines. There were 7 medals of honor awarded to Jesse Scouts through their activities, which are really extraordinary. In many cases, the stories are extraordinary, capturing the battle flags, rescuing comrades, delivering the crucial intelligence that will literally help change or shape the war. It's the extraordinary set of individuals that really, through their agency, change things.
No question about it. And if I recall correctly, your book opens with the story of one of those Jesse Scouts out near the Shenandoah out past Front Royal, as I remember, because I visited the spot where one of them was caught and hanged. Right. So it's a kind of ends on or it begins on a sad note in that sense, but like you said, it was incredibly dangerous work that they were doing, and they certainly paid the price for it.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're referencing the Plains, Virginia, where
Hmm.
one of the scouts, Jack Sterry, they're involved in deception operations in many cases, and these are perilous. Jack's situation was reckless beyond belief. I mean, he literally tried to lead General Hood's entire corps down the wrong road for the second Battle of Manassas, and he spent 45 minutes basically trying to get Hood to do that, and he was partially successful in the sense that he tied up Hood's horse for 45 minutes until they unmasked him, and he was hanged. And there's a sign that in one of the all the books that I've ever written have found me in one way or another, and that's one of the signs that I found. It's near the Front Porch Cafe restaurant, which details sort of a little bit of what happened there, and then they later found Jack's body as well as the Confederate courier that he killed earlier in the day. Their both bodies were found when they widened the road near the plains.
Hmm. Yeah, amazing. That is a beautiful little town, by the way. Certainly worth the drive out there. And like I
It,
said in the first interview with you, I really love having all this history around me and in driving distance, and I can go and check it out for myself and just get a slight sense of what was really going on right here around us, right there under our feet all the time. So this book very
what's
much
so
hit home for
amazing
me.
is that the book is a built-in driving tour, and it's history in plain
Yep.
sight. I
Yep.
made it that way so that you could visit Jack's, final moments on Earth, to the safe house that Mosby hid in the tree branch, the tree that's still there where he hid from
Hmm.
an entire company of Union Cavalry. It's on and on and on. The artifacts in skirmish areas, these places still exist, and much of Loudoun County is still picturesque and gorgeous and beautiful, much
Oh yeah.
like the American Civil War. It's a great way to spend a weekend, to just go to some of these places and soak up the rich history that's all around us. And in most cases, many people don't have any idea.
Hmm.
For instance, I was writing my next book in Middleburg, the Oyster House Bar, and it's right across the street from the Red Fox Inn, which was used as a field hospital for Mosby's operations. But it's there that in the backyard of that place that Charlie McDonough, one of Mosby's Rangers, one of the men that Blazer hunted and the other Jesse Scouts hunted, he has his last stand. He faces the 8th Illinois Cavalry, elements of them, and he vows to never be taken alive. And he sends with his Colt 5 bullets downrange at the 8th Illinois, and the 6th bullet is he puts in his skull and kills
Gosh.
himself
My
because
gosh.
he does not want to be taken alive.
Hmm.
And that is an example of a skirmish of one of these sort of unknown stories, but it's all around us.
Hmm. Yeah, totally agree. Totally agree. Really, really enjoyed that aspect of it. No question about it. And I still am because I still have a lot of sites left to visit. No doubt about it. So I want to talk a little bit about Mosby's Rangers as well. And since you mentioned irregular warfare at the beginning, I believe that the Confederate States government passed something called the Partisan Rangers Act. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Sure, the Partisan Ranger Act is the Confederate States of America's way of trying to, in some ways, rein in these irregular forces. The act puts these irregulars under the command of the Confederate Army, under their overall control. Because if you look at counterinsurgency or insurgencies in general, one of the things that's a tipping point, it's often atrocities that are committed by either side. And one of the things that the South was concerned about is that these irregular units were literally committing atrocities against Southern civilians or even potentially Northern civilians that might have been sympathetic to the South's cause. So they wanted to utilize this Partisan Ranger Act to sort of rein these units in. However, one of the things that the South has a constant battle with internally, it's mainly Robert E. Lee, is this sort of ungentlemanly aspect of warfare. It's not looked upon as righteous. It's ungentlemanly warfare, and it's a struggle that America would have. It still has a little bit to some degree throughout its history of sending good men, for instance, to these irregular units, whereas they could be in a line company or in a regular unit. This is a struggle that we faced in World War II and then beyond. But it's a struggle that the South had, and they were trying to rein them in. One thing that Mosby and the Confederate Secret Service were pioneering in the first modern war, the American Civil War, is how to fight irregularly. They were taking the lessons that were learned from the American Revolution, where we have a rich history of it, and expanding upon it and utilizing it. And the South had, the support of almost the entire Southern population, which makes a modern insurgency almost impossible to defeat. Had they conducted hybrid warfare where it was conventional and unconventional, the American Civil War may have been even more difficult to extinguish. And it's these men that, such as John Singleton Mosby and his Rangers, that are developing and pioneering and expanding upon. And it would be, as my book brings out, really for the first time, in 1941, the United States did not have unconventional forces or special operations forces. And it would fall upon the shoulders of Wild Bill Donovan, who was looking at his adversaries, the German military machine, which had utilized unconventional warfare very, very effectively, and that they were completely behind the power curve. So they wanted to look at examples, and it was probably Donovan's idea to actually look at the American Civil War, specifically at Mosby, the Jesse Scouts, and the Confederate Secret Services. I brought out the different documents that I found in the archives, and as well as the veterans that I've interviewed. And I've interviewed hundreds of operatives from the OSS, men and women, as well as individuals from the research and development or the research and analysis arm. I'm on the board at the OSS Society and the historian, but it's something I've been studying the OSS for 25 years and written multiple books on the subject.
Yeah, it's an amazing starting point, certainly, and there are tremendous lessons to be learned despite the vast differences in technology and environment and all that occurred obviously between 1860s and 1940s, but some truly timeless lessons there. And I was kind of astonished to read in the book. I'd heard the name Mosby before. I did not know much about him at all before I read the book, but I believe that you called him possibly one of the most talented guerrilla leaders in world history, if I'm paraphrasing. But he was truly one in a million.
Certainly in American history and and potentially that as well. Just John Singleton Mosby is extraordinary in many, many ways. It's unexpected. I mean, he's a 5'7" kind of wiry guy that's 128 pounds, lawyer, just not who you would think is this great partisan leader, but has this amazing presence. He has an understanding of what he wants to accomplish. He takes literally 6 men that he's given in the winter of 1863 and expands it to nearly 1,000 and ties up tens of thousands of federal troops.
My gosh.
And that is his goal. Through a regular warfare, he cuts supply lines, he attacks high-value targets, captures generals, burns bridges, burns wagon trains. But as he states, ultimately, his goal is to force the Federals to conduct security operations, which leads troops off the main line to deal with him. And it takes, if you total it all up, tens of thousands of Federal troops were tied up trying to hunt Mosby.
Man. Incredible punching above his weight, so to speak.
And had they taken the model of Richard Blazer and the Jesse Scouts and multiplied that maybe 2 or 3 times and come at him from multiple directions, they probably would have collapsed Mosby's Confederacy and Mosby's guerrilla operations, which were unvanquished and largely undefeated. There were only a few companies that were defeated, during the war, and they were largely from Blazer Scouts and some of the activities that they had. Otherwise, they would annihilate most of the foes that they had ever came after John Singleton Mosby's Rangers.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the things I wanted the reader to understand is just how daunting a task the Jesse Scouts faced, at least one aspect of the Jesse Scouts faced, of trying to deal with John Singleton Mosby.
Clearly had their work cut out for them. So Mosby had just incredible number of escapades, honestly, throughout the war. And one in particular that we didn't talk about last time, I don't believe, was when he was captured. So he was taken prisoner in 1862, but he still managed to gather and pass along some intelligence, some extremely valuable intelligence as a prisoner, right?
I think this exemplifies just who John Singleton Mosby was. This is an incredible story. Mosby began his first foray into partisan or guerrilla operations is a disaster. Jeb Stuart, who's his boss, in 1862, gives him a single man with a club foot and says, "Go ahead, you can go ahead and start your partisan Rangers." So Mosby sets out, and he's at a train station, and no sooner does he dismount from his horse, leaves his pistols on his horse, he's surrounded by a company of Union Cavalry, along with the guy with the club foot, and they're captured, and they're sent away, and he's in a federal confinement for several months, and he's given the opportunity to be exchanged for a prisoner. A Union officer is exchanged for him, and as he's being exchanged, he's leaving Fort Monroe, which is near Williamsburg on the James River, and he's being taken back to Richmond on a steamboat. And this is kind of the classic case of Mosby. He recognizes small details, and one of the small details he recognizes is the captain of the boat. He seems to think he has Confederate leanings, and he starts to press him and probe him for information. And sure enough, this guy is a Southern sympathizer. And he starts to divulge things about troops that he's moved around. And then he's able to take that information, as well as information that he sees on the journey of different troop movements, and process that into actionable intelligence that the Union Army is going to be on the move and on the offensive. And this is, it's incredible stuff that nobody really understands, but Mosby has that detailed information. And he's only a lieutenant at the time, gets off the boat, and instead of, he spent several months in a Union prison and, starving and everything else. Instead of just, getting lunch or whatever, he immediately rides to General Lee's headquarters and shows up as this lowly lieutenant. who Lee sort of recognizes because Mosby was a great scout with Stewart, and he did a ride around Richmond. Sort of has a little bit of a reputation, but not much. And he listens to what Mosby. He's initially a little bit skeptical because he's just lieutenant, but he recognizes the value of what Mosby is bringing to him. And it's intelligence that is actionable, and it's intelligence that literally changes the course of a battle. That it's Mosby, and it's Mosby's actions, and it's Mosby's intelligence that provide that. And at the Battle of Cedar Mountain, it's all Mosby. And it's a case where Mosby changes things through his agency. And he's given another opportunity where he goes to Stewart in late December 1862, the beginning of the winter of 1863, right outside of Middleburg in a mansion, and basically asks for the opportunity to start up the partisan corps again. And he's given 6 men, including his best friend, and they set out. And those men will eventually become 1,000 almost strong in multiple companies. And within about a month and a half, 2 months, he pulls off one of his greatest operations. He captures a Union general in Fairfax City and brings him out. General Stoughton, literally penetrates an entire Union cavalry encampment and brings this guy out. One of the great special operations raids in world history, American history.
Truly. I was honestly on the edge of my seat reading that portion of the book.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because Mosby utilizes his wits. He does an operation that's so audacious, it's unexpected. He also has a secret weapon, so to speak, a Union deserter, a guy by the name of Big Yankee Ames, who doesn't like the Emancipation Proclamation and literally deserts from the 5th New York Cavalry and comes into Mosby's lines unarmed and wants to be a ranger. Initially, they are very skeptical. They believe him to some degree. Mosby believes him. And his first mission as a ranger is to find a horse for himself. And he literally has to go to Centerville, where there's a massive Union cavalry encampment, goes in, knows the passwords, and comes out with his horse along with another ranger. They both ride back to Mosby's Rangers with their horses.
Wow.
And that's the beginning of really an amazing legacy with Big Yankee Ames, too. Is just an incredibly brutal ranger that's very effective.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he was a major character in the book, no doubt about it. Fascinating guy. There was another incident, I don't know if I'd call it incident, another operation that Mosby pulled off where he went into Alexandria, which I guess was heavily occupied by the Union at the time, and he captured this Colonel Daniel Delaney at his home. Can you talk about that as well?
Yeah, this is their operation is to burn a bridge, and it's also to capture this Union officer. They wanted to try to actually capture the governor. They weren't able to locate him, so they kind of went to their secondary target. And what's interesting about this book is it's really truly brother against brother, and it's not cliche. It's family against family. And one of Mosby's Rangers was the son of the man that they were capturing. And they walk up to the door and they knock. And initially, the guy that they're Colonel Delaney, he believes that these are Jesse Scouts because they're all dressed as Confederates, and he welcomes them as Jesse Scouts, and then he realizes that his son is with the entourage.
Man.
And his son is fighting for the Confederacy. There's a very awkward moment as they bring his father into captivity. But man, that's some of the moments in this book that are just priceless. I mean, they're remarkable in many ways.
It really is. I can't imagine the electricity in the room, son capturing his own father on a raid behind enemy lines like that. Just unbelievable.
And I don't think that the family necessarily got together after the war.
Yeah, that will cause a rift, no doubt about it.
Yeah, a little
My
bit.
gosh. Before we go on, I want to tell you all about a new podcast from Tenderfoot TV called To Die For. Imagine you were a fly on the wall at a dinner between the Mafia, the CIA, and the KGB. That's where this unprecedented podcast begins. Brought to you by the makers of the hit podcast To Live and Die in LA, To Die For marks the first time a Russian-trained honey trap has told her story from beginning to end. Taught to seduce men for their secrets and sometimes their lives, Alia Rosa was trained to believe that her body no longer belonged to her. It belonged to the state. She was meticulously trained to be the perfect weapon, able to seduce her targets into compromising situations that have ended careers and sometimes lives. From Tenderfoot TV, the studio that brought you Up and Vanished, and To Live and Die in LA. Make sure you check out To Die For, available beginning on March 26th, wherever you get your podcasts. So, I also wanted to ask you about Thurman's Rangers. I don't believe we talked about them. They seem like a sort of a, I wouldn't say lesser portion of the book, but they have a smaller role to play anyway. But they were sort of a terror in West Virginia, weren't they?
They were. And what you find is that West Virginia or Western Virginia is really the proving ground for many of these regular units. It's a cauldron of family versus family in Appalachia. It's a divided area where there's, portions of the western part of Western Virginia are very heavily South. And then as you go further north into the West, it's more pro-union. And this is the sort of cauldron that existed in that area. And what's important about it during the war was the major supply lines ran through it. B&O Railroad, for instance, and then Route 50, which was a major road that a lot of supplies would go down. Coming from Pittsburgh and Cleveland and those areas. So they need the North needed to have control of portions of it. There was also a lot of minerals there that the South needed, and the Southern railroads. Some of them passed through the very far western portion of what's now West Virginia, or eastern portion, I should say, becomes a state in the summer of 1863. What was fascinating is it's a slave state that becomes part of the Union in 1863, which is kind of mind blowing if you think about how that all
Mm-hmm.
works out. But it's in this kind of cauldron that partisan groups are born, and one of them is Thurman's Rangers, and this is a family affair. It's two brothers that are just absolute diehard Confederates, slavers that take they have some wealth, and they take the families within Appalachia. Think about Hatfields and McCoy and the different feuds and such, and they bring these people together to fight a common enemy, which is the North. And it's a brutal area. People are burned out of their houses by either side, and the Thurmans provide protection to the Southerners that are loyal to them. Many of the men they furnish. Many of the men in that unit are from the local area, and it's a real problem for the North because these guys are running around causing all kinds of havoc, cutting supply lines, ambushing wagon trains. So they wanted a way to deal with it, and the way to deal with it was Richard Blazer, and he's just a tough Ohioan that is initially just a lieutenant, but he has sort of skills of as a manhunter, and he's a natural at it. And they put together a company of men, which are the best rifle shots, the best woodsmen within several regiments of Ohio and West Virginia units that operate in the West Virginia area. And it's a composite unit of the best woodsmen and crack shots and manhunters that the Union can find. And they're under the command of Richard Blazer, but also another lieutenant who would later found the LA Times. And
Hmm.
that's a fascinating story. He only sticks around for a few weeks, and it becomes Blazer's independent scouts. And they are very effective going after the Thurmans. And they use tactical intelligence that they glean from various civilians, whoever they can divide, they can gain intelligence from. What's remarkable is that their first operations are largely they're on foot. They are not on horseback because the area in most cases is extremely rugged. This is Appalachia. It's all mountainous. It's gorgeous. It's near the New River Gorge where many of these operations are taking place. And it's not until General Crook takes command of the army in the area that they become mounted on horseback, and they're even more effective. And they really, in many cases, neutralize Thurman's Rangers and kill one of the Thurman brothers. They're effective. It's sort of in some ways it's a JV team
Hmm.
compared to who they're going to be dealing with Mosby's Rangers, but they really gained some very important tradecraft and skills combating the Thurman
Okay.
brothers.
I see. I see. Patrick, I might be mixing up my stories here, so correct me if I'm wrong. Was it the Thurman Scouts, or I'm sorry, Thurman's Rangers, who discovered a suspected enemy spy and they staked him out on the ground to die of exposure, or is that someone else who had done that?
That is someone else. That
Okay.
is a guy by the name of John Mobberly.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
if we want to talk about him, we can go to him now.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue. Actually, please. He's
John
unbelievable.
John Moberly is from the Loudoun County area. He was initially with the 35th Cavalry Regiment, known as White's Cavalry, and they're White's Comanches. It's another cavalry unit, but when they were off, this guy deserted when they came home. He deserted and basically creates his own outlaw unit. And he is a ruthless, bloodthirsty Confederate that Mosby operates in a very he operates within the rules of warfare, and he's also very humane and treats prisoners properly in almost every case. And what's interesting is he will save a number of Union officers from certain death, or that are nearly mortally wounded or very severely wounded, and then later they would become very close friends after the war.
Hmm.
And many of these men would rise to the rank of governor. They remembered that John Singleton Mosby saved and protected them. This guy, on the other hand, is a 19-year-old bloodthirsty teen that his goal in life was to kill, Union soldiers, and he didn't just kill them. He tortured them in many cases. He would take prisoners and and bring them out to a remote rocky area and put boulders on their arms and legs and let them rot and die. No sense of humanity or compassion. He operated in this manner, and there's some operations that were conducted with Mosby, but he never was a member of the Rangers because Mosby wouldn't have allowed his sort of unlawful or undisciplined character. He was effective and extremely ruthless. And one of the incidents that you wanted to bring out was a guy by the name of Stewart was part of one of the rival groups within Loudoun County. They were known as the Loudoun Rangers, and they were a group of men that were Unionists that came from Loudoun County and the northern portion of it, and they formed their own unit, and they operated. They were pretty effective, and Moberly ambushed one of those groups. Waterford is a really interesting kind of town within Loudoun County. It's in the northern portion. It's worth a visit. It's kind of like frozen in time in many ways because so many of the buildings are from the Civil War. and he captures Stewart and mercilessly tries to execute him by running him over with his horse, and then firing a pistol at point blank range into his helpless torso. And somehow Stewart survives. I don't know. Nobody knows how, even though he's got several pistol bullets in his torso. And he comes back with a vengeance. And Mobberly is a wanted man throughout the entire Civil War, and he has a $1,000 bounty on his head. And Stewart eventually gets his revenge in April 1865. In the waning days of the war, they ambush Mobberly and kill him. And one of the things the reader can do is visit. You can go to a place called Loudoun Heights, where one of my chapters called Crimson Snow. It's where one of the units that Mosby went after was there, but on the road up towards the heights, is Mobberly's grave, and it's not far from Hillsboro, Virginia. And his grave is there, and his portrait, his picture his image is haunting.
Yeah, that story really is astonishing. That personal vendetta that plays out over a period of, I think it was over a year, I believe, because Stewart spent a lot of time recuperating from being shot and trampled
Right.
by a horse before he was well enough to get back into the battle. And then he winds up, just unbelievable, serendipitous moment there. He winds up again with Mobberly in his sights over a year later. Just an incredible story.
Yes, it is. And there's different stories like this of vengeance within the book, as well as stories of great compassion, which are unexpected as well,
Mm-hmm.
where individuals you would think would execute one another, but somehow their humanity comes to the surface, and there's a better sense, better angels, if you will, surface as well. So there's different, the book is so multidimensional in that aspect.
Yeah, it really is. And it just drives home how all these people had, I shouldn't say all, but so many of them, I mean, they'd grown up within a fairly close distance of each other. These are not enemies from across the sea or anything like that. These people had so much in common and at each other's throats, but humanity showed through in some cases, and the worst of humanity showed through in some cases as well, with, like we talked about just now, with Moberly.
Exactly. And then at the same time, forgiveness, the ultimate
Right.
sense of forgiveness comes through, especially at the end of the war, which is, I think, one of the great traits of the book, of how, two sides which are so embroiled and enmeshed in deadly warfare forgive and then come together as Americans. It's a lesson that I think is, relevant in 1865 as it is today.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. A divided populace like that, like how do you patch things back up and move on and become whole again? And no easy task for anybody under any circumstances. But some
No.
people, certainly including Mosby himself, did the very best that they could, despite the criticisms that came along with that.
Yes.
So that's already jumping on to the end of the story. Honestly, of course, everyone knows that war came to an end, and eventually we reunified. But I did want to ask you also about another incredibly unique character from the book, Aaron Burton. Can you tell us a little bit about him?
I think this is one of my favorite characters. Is really an underreported individual.
I agree.
There is a Black Ranger, and this is Aaron Burton. And Aaron Burton is Mosby's body man. He's basically a Batman, as they would call him in the English service. He's a servant for John Singleton Mosby. He was a family slave with Mosby that he basically he helped raise John Singleton Mosby. He was a great friend of John Singleton Mosby. And Mosby brings him into the war. And he's there through most of the entire process. And we suspect, armed in many cases. He's trusted as a ranger and does different things. I mean, the fact that he is, looked at as an enslaved individual gives him certain access to areas that the Rangers might not have. He'd go into an area and be unsuspected. At the same time, he was taking his, life in his. I mean, he was doing extremely risky stuff as a Confederate, as a black Confederate, which is, really remarkable in so many ways. And he was given, a role of importance and responsibility. Often, whenever they would come back from a raid, they would give him the spoils of the raid, and he would be tasked with, processing it and bringing it back to a safe area. And he was considered a ranger. And what I find interesting is after the war, he appears in the photos at the reunions with these
My
guys.
God.
Yeah, he's not looked at as a second-class citizen. And Mosby, after the war, I mean, he falls upon this individual falls upon some hard times, but Mosby continues to send him money when he needs it to keep him afloat, because he looks at this man as a friend, an important person. And one of my favorite interactions in the book, I shouldn't say favorite, but it's compelling, is how he is this enslaved man that rides with Mosby, and he does it willingly, confronts another individual who is his name is Wash in the book, or Washington, and he was a body man or a Batman for a Union officer in the book, and he's captured. And these two men have this amazing scene where they're together, and the other man is captured by Mosby's Rangers along with his officer, and it goes into one of the great escapes in of the book, and there's many of them. And this group is brought under Captain Badger, they're being brought to Richmond, where they're going to be processed as prisoners of war. And within the group are two of the Jesse Scouts that are also rounded up. And they have one of the most advanced weapons of the war at the time, at least from a firearms perspective, which is a repeating rifle or carbine. It's in one of the saddlebags, and it's an incredible story. They escape, and the story of what Wash has to endure, within this group is incredible too. And it brings out a sad side of the war, because Wash, you would think, would be, as a prisoner with Badger, would be, just as important. And Badger, I mean, he admits in writing that they literally talked about killing Wash and cannibalizing him because they were hungry.
Oh my God.
And it's just, it's striking that you would think that wouldn't occur within the Union Army. And it's one of the scenes that just is striking in the book, in The Unvanquished. Mm-hmm. And that escape is an extraordinary story as well.
Yeah. It really brings history to life, and it's such a compelling read. Honestly, just such a page turner. And knowing that all this happened here, it was not that long ago in so many senses, and the things that these people endured and the things that they did to help each other and to hurt each other and all that, it's really just astonishing stuff. And I can see, we were talking about Aaron, and I have a hard time really kind of defining or understanding the relationship that he must have had with Mosby to be so trusted to stick with him through the war, and then to be cared for in his old age by Mosby, when that just obviously defies the typical slave and slave owner relationship that we might perceive from 130 years later.
I think they were close friends, and
Mm-hmm.
I think he was actually proud to serve as a Ranger.
Man.
I think that's pretty obvious. And I think the book breaks stereotypes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a cliche book. It's not a book of what you expect from the Civil War. In fact, it's, in many ways, many people think it's an entirely different perspective.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All the reviews, from the Wall Street Journal to Army Magazine to They've hailed the book from it's the war. The Unvanquished is the Civil War from the saddle. It puts you there.
Oh yeah, yeah. I wholeheartedly agree with that. No doubt about it. Just an amazing cast of characters. I shouldn't even use the phrase cast of characters because that's a fictional term in my mind. Just amazing human beings that lived and
Right.
fought and died and survived and shaped the world and the country that we live in right now.
Exactly.
Wow. So one final person I want to ask you about, Patrick, and we've already talked about him a little bit, but really wanted to give him his due because he is just another astonishing figure. Honestly, is Benjamin Stringfellow. So can you just reiterate a little bit about Benjamin's incredible life?
Ben Stringfellow is this 90-pound, sort of effeminate scout slash spy that is really pretty extraordinary in his own way too. And we first encounter Stringfellow in the Crimson Snow chapter of the Unvanquished, and they're going after Mosby's Rangers are going after a Union cavalry group that is operating in Loudoun Heights. This is not far from Hillsborough, Virginia, and Harper's Ferry. It's on the actual mountain heights in that area. They have their encampment. It's Cole's Independent Cavalry unit that's raised from many locals in the area. And earlier, a few days earlier, they had made a foray into Mosby's Confederacy, and the raid didn't go well. Mosby basically annihilated this company that went in there on a raid, and Mosby decided that he was going to basically go after the head of the snake and attack their encampment, which is on Loudoun Heights. And this begins in the early days of 1864, and it's wintry out, and they mount up two companies of Rangers, and they go after the encampment on Loudoun Heights. It's really quite an epic story. And Stringfellow is the guide that Mosby utilizes because he kind of has a sense of the area, and he leads the raid. But in the process, he also does something he shouldn't do, and that is unauthorized. He starts firing before he's supposed to, and blows the position.
Hmm.
And the raid on Loudoun Heights is one of the few really sort of disastrous ones that Mosby's Rangers are lucky that they survived without too many casualties, but they limp back hard, but they're defeated. But it's Stringfellow that leads it. And Stringfellow then has some very fascinating kind of roles. There's another very important raid that takes place, and Stringfellow is able to, according to his own account, infiltrate the Union cavalry encampment near Brandy Station. And he does it in a unique and novel way. He dresses as a Southern woman and, is basically in a ballroom with, in his Southern dress and everything else. He's got this long flowing hair, and he mixes with the Union officers, and he's allegedly able to gain some intelligence from that. It's just fascinating stuff that, he's part of. And then he's part of the Confederate Secret Service and is a deep spy on different missions that are, the book is another element of the book, The Unvanquished, is we do a deep dive into the Confederate Secret Service because it's one of the groups that interacts with the Jesse Scouts in a very unique way. It's the main Richard Blazer is captured by a member of the Confederate Secret Service, Lewis Powell, who's also a member of Mosby's Rangers,
Mm-hmm.
who's also a conspirator in the Lincoln conspiracy and Lincoln kidnapping, which I also get into in the book in a lot of detail, and it puts a lot of the threads that have not been put together for the first time in many ways. It's one of the things that the book really, it also captures that story.
It does, and we spent a lot of time talking about that in the last episode, I believe. So anyone who doesn't recall that or hasn't heard it yet should definitely go back to episode 146 for that. But I was astonished at the level of capability because I thought of the Confederacy as a bunch of very brave and hard charging guys, but sort of ill equipped and somewhat ill prepared for the war was my somewhat uneducated opinion and my perspective back then. But I mean, the Confederate Secret Service, I mean, they got some licks in, no question about it. And the Lincoln assassination itself was really just like a multi-pronged simultaneous strike. I mean, absolutely amazing stuff that they could pull off something that audacious, honestly.
This is multifactorial. There's the assassination decapitation mission, which begins as a kidnapping, but within the Confederate Secret Service conducts many novel operations, and it's these operations and the apparatus that they develop is incredible, and it's under pressure of war that they develop many novel gadgets, devices, as well as, you can argue the origins of color revolution and the insurrection that they tried to hatch
Hmm.
at the time of the election in 1864, and the interference that they provided in the election of 1864, which is mind blowing, considering the main asset within the Copperhead movement was paid by and controlled by the Confederate Secret Service, which then helped write the campaign platform for the Democratic Party in 1864. This is incredible stuff that is, decades ahead of their time. And then their press influence operations that they conduct,
Hmm.
the information warfare operations, all stuff that's really very novel, and what's old is new.
Truly, truly, truly. Amazing stories. Just that's why I had to bring you back again, Patrick, for the same
Thank you
book.
so
Just
much for
one story
having me.
after another. Yeah, no question about it. So, was there anything, because clearly these stories just abound? Was there anything that you had to leave out of the book, or you wanted to save for later publication, or just didn't have room for anything like that? Because I'm just astonished by what you were able to pack in so far. Honestly.
There was a lot of, I mean, Mosby's operations in the book are, that is a separate book, as well as the Confederate Secret Service. So what
Mm-hmm.
I had to do were the stories that were emblematic of each, but also the stories that were, connected or tied together with the Jesse Scouts. These are the stories that intersected. So there are many stories that were not told because they're a separate book. The scope of the book was fairly extensive to begin with. So it's like I had to pare things down, and I also had to very much keep in mind what I really wanted to tell, and that was the story of the Jesse Scouts primarily.
Mm-hmm.
That is the through line of the book, but also the story of irregular warfare during the American Civil War and its connections to 1941, and the sort of the connections to today. But what I really wanted to do was focus on the Jesse Scouts and the interactions that they had with these other groups.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to make it I wanted to put the reader in the saddle. That was the goal of The Vanquished. And many of the reviewers have said that was accomplished.
Great. Yeah, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. So, since you've thought about that, are you planning to return to this time period again, or any of these characters at all, in expanded form, maybe?
My number one priority right now is to return to the American Revolution.
Okay.
I'm in the process of been deep in that book for the last 2 years. I usually write two books at once. I'm well in that now, and it's another elite unit that hasn't been covered. I can't get into the details,
Sure.
but it's important. Just like, I've written now 14 books on American War, and they're all the through line of all of that is it's about elite units and special operations
Hmm.
units. It's also about individuals that, through their agency can change history, and that's certainly the case with the next book. And I also will be returning at some point fairly soon to the American Civil War as well, and
Fantastic.
hopefully Vietnam. That's another
Oh, wow.
another
Okay, yeah.
Another goal, because I've had a lot of people say to me, "You've written about everything from the American Revolution to the Battle of Fallujah. What about Vietnam?" And I said, "Well, that's definitely on the list as well."
hmm Okay, yeah, that sounds fantastic. So the next book that you're working on, do you anticipate it will be out like in 2025, for example, or any set
It'll
time
be out in
period yet?
it'll be out in 2026 for the
Okay.
250th anniversary of
Oh,
our founding.
okay. Fantastic. Fantastic. I'm really looking
Yes,
forward to that. So I'll stay tuned for more developments in that case.
absolutely. Thank you for having me. Yeah, people can find me on at Combat Historian. That's my X account. The front of the store at Barnes and Noble is where the Unvanquished is.
Yeah.
It lives. Been a bestseller along with Amazon.com and pretty much every other independent bookstore as well. Yeah, I've just been, it's been an honor to go back to the Civil War and walk in the footsteps of so many of these American pioneers and
hmm
what they developed.
Fantastic. And you're right. My local Barnes and Noble, I've seen your book. It's still been on the new and notable table the last probably 5 times that I've been in there, I think. So still going strong. They wouldn't keep it out there if it wasn't selling, I don't think. So all right. Well, I'm glad to hear, Patrick. Thank you so much. So I'm definitely going to stay tuned, and I hope to have you back again on the show sometime for a new subject.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your in depth and your excellent questions.
Oh,
Thank you for really capturing the essence of the Unvanquished.
yeah, I appreciate it. So, I'd be reading these books regardless. So it's great that I can tie it into a podcast and actually talk to the author and all that. That's a lot of fun for me, and they seem to get a lot out of it too when I do my homework, so to speak.
You do an excellent job.
All
Thank
right.
you, Justin.
Well, thank you, Patrick. Take care.
Bye bye.
If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.